When it comes to RLCS, most fans tend to focus on the two major regions, North America and Europe. These two regions have the closest competitions, they send the most people to LAN, and they on average have better teams. That being said, people are starting to take more notice of the 5 other regions that compete in RLCS. Team Falcons, the best team out of Middle East, went to the Spring Major Finals in 2022. South America has had 2 different teams finish top 4 at RLCS LANs, and they've even won a non-RLCS LAN. A region that tends to get overlooked a little bit is Oceania. They've been around the longest outside of North America and Europe, but with less of a player base and being more disconnected from the major regions, they haven't had as much success. That being said, the region is still very competitive, and everyone's trying to fight for those 2 LAN spots so they can go prove to the world that this region is still competitive. Since the end of the COVID era, there have been 3 different teams from Oceania to represent them at the world stage. Those teams are Renegades, Power, and Pioneers. When Renegades disbanded in the offseason, everyone assumed that Oceania would turn into a 2-horse race for LANs between Power and Pioneers. However, when Pioneers struggled at the Fall Major and decided to make a roster change, it led to one of the craziest offseason shuffles I think I've ever seen in RLCS. And that's saying something. For those who don't know, Pioneers is a team who came bursting onto the scene about a year ago with a roster of Scrub, Banana Head, and Super Locky. They qualified for last year's Winter Major, Spring Major, and World Championship, and their most notable LAN performance is when they knocked BDS out of the Spring Major in last place. However, at the Fall Major this year, they didn't have as much success, as they went 0-3 in series and 0-9 in games. It was at this point that Scrub and Banana Head decided to make a roster change, and Super Locky was off the team. In Super Locky's place, they decided to pick up a young mechanical talent in Hunter, who came from a team called the Lake Show. Now this is where things get interesting. In order to retain your RLCS points, you need to have 2 out of 3 of your main roster. And this wasn't the case for Lake Show, as Siki had announced his retirement earlier in the trade window. This left Mach without any teammates and without any RLCS points. But don't worry, we'll get back to Mach later. Another thing that happened fairly early on in the trade window is that Ground Zero announced that they were going to replace Finn with Fiber. However, when Super Locky became available, Ground Zero decided they wanted to pick him up as well. So therefore, the new Ground Zero roster was Fiber, Kaka, and Super Locky. Because of this roster change, Ground Zero has also forfeited all of their RLCS points. They were in 3rd place. Well, actually, they were tied for 3rd place with placeholders. So now, given that Ground Zero has no points and Lake Show has no points, placeholders sitting nicely in 3rd place with no one else around them. Except they weren't. During the trade window, Misty decided to join Mach and Shores to form the Him Police. Since Fiber had already left placeholders, this left them with no RLCS points as well. So when you break it down, 3 out of the top 5 teams in OCE forfeited all their RLCS points. And if you think it stops there, it doesn't. By the end of the trade window, only 9 teams had retained their RLCS points. But it's fine, right? Because only 8 teams qualify for the main event via the RLCS points they've retained. Except it's not fine. It's not fine at all. While the team Dubbo Demons is still sitting on their 6 points, they have technically disbanded. The reason they still have their points is because they never really signed up with new teams, therefore they could theoretically still get back together and have those 6 points. At least I think they can. Don't quote me on that. This leaves us with only 8 teams remaining, except Trey Connie has declined their invite to the event, which opens up a 9th spot from the closed qualifier. What is happening here? Trey Connie is the former Physicist roster, and if that name rings a bell to you, it's probably because you're on the RLCS subreddit way too much, just like me, because I remember there was one guy who was obsessed with Physicists, and he just predicted them to win the entire turn. Anyways, this is a roster of Gus, Ames, and Caveman Ben. Caveman Ben was actually on Mindfreak when they won the Fall Major in the COVID era. So why did this team decline their invite? Oh, it's because Gus left for Gremlins, which means Ames and Caveman Ben are just sitting on their RLCS points without a 3rd. I have never seen this happen before. So we're down to 7 teams. Anyone who has RLCS points is automatically qualified for the first event. Instead of taking 16 teams from the open qualifiers, they decided to invite a few teams that they knew would be at the top of OCE. And honestly, I think that's fair, because only one of the teams that came through the open qualifier actually made it to the main event. Actually, 2 of them did. I forgot there was a tiebreaker for the 9th through 11th teams because, again, there were only 7 teams invited to the main event. So finally, you think the chaos is over, right? You got 16 teams qualified for your next event. You're done with the trade window. Everything's fine. What in the group of death? Now look, I've seen some groups of death in my time. I mean, the North America Winter Open, you had Group B and Group D both look very menacing. But this is actually absurd. How did we end up with this group of death? Okay, let's break this down. Group B consists of the 2 seed, the 8 seed, the 11 seed, and the 13 seed. Pioneers are second in RLCS points and have acquired the 2 seed based on their points in the last 3 events. Ground Zero took the 1st seed out of the closed qualifiers, which put them in the 8th seed spot. The Him Police ended up dropping a series in the closed qualifiers to Dumb Luck Esports, so this dropped them to the 4th seed in the closed qualifiers, which puts them at the 11th seed in the main event. And for those who don't know, Attack of the Invisible Ninjas are no slouch either. This is the roster of Leduc, Walcott, and Spydoge, and if those names sound familiar, it's probably because you saw the Season 8 World Championship where they were representing Canberra Havoc. So yeah, this is the definition of a group of death. Despite this, the group started off with results that you might expect. Both Pioneers and Ground Zero were able to take care of their first 2 rounds, and so they met in the 3rd round undefeated to determine who would get the 1 seed. And while the teams that Ground Zero had already faced weren't slouches, this was the real test. This is where you see if you can compete for those 2 land spots and take that away from Pioneers. And let me tell you, Super Lucky let them know.
I'm running drop.
Ground Zero swept Pioneers in order to take the 1 seed in their group, but more importantly, this dropped Pioneers down to the 2 seed in Group B. After Pioneers dispatched to Dire Wolves, this put them facing off against Power in the quarterfinals. That's right, the 2 land teams in the quarterfinals. Now, if you're Pioneers, your backs are against the wall. You needed that 1 seed coming out of the group because Power is the Oceanic super team. They have Amphis, who was OCE's star player in RLCS X. They have Fever, who was the star on Renegades all of last season. And they have Torsos, longtime OCE veteran. This team had won the last 2 Oceanic events and went 2-3 in the Fall Major, including upsetting G2 in a 3-0 sweep. The series was back and forth. Power started out strong in Game 1, but Pioneers answered back in Games 2 and 3. Amphis hit this amazing shot.
Could be over right here.
It certainly could, but Amphis, no way!
Stop it!
And Power ended up taking Game 4, but Pioneers, yet again, bounced back in Game 5 and were able to close it in 6. So yeah, the Oceanic super team was out in the quarterfinals. Now, if you're worried about Power, don't be. In the fall split of this season, Power actually went out in the quarterfinals of their first event as well, and then bounced back to win the next 2 events to make the major. It might take some event wins, but this team is still in control of their destiny when it comes to the Winter Major. The rest of the quarterfinals went just about as expected, with Ground Zero and the Him Police both beating their opponents to make the semifinals. The semifinals also went as expected, as Pioneers were able to take down Dumbluck Esports and Ground Zero swept the Him Police again, so both teams would meet in the finals. And amid all this chaos, it took me this long to realize that Ground Zero had actually gone undefeated in their entire run up until now. This team had not lost a single game with this new roster, including going 9-0 in their group, 9-0 in closed qualifiers, and sweeping their 2 opponents in the playoffs. Of course, the Ground Zero Twitter account had to jinx them by tweeting out that they were 26-0, but it didn't bother them initially as they started out the finals by going up 3-0. It wasn't until tournament point that Ground Zero dropped a game, and that was in a 2-minute overtime to the second best team in the tournament. That being said, Ground Zero cleaned it up in Game 5 and won their first tournament as a team. Yet again, Super Lucky and the boys were pretty hype about it. And honestly, how could you not be? This was Super Lucky's revenge tour against the team that had kicked him. This was Fiber's first win since the Winter Regional 1 of last season. And for Kaka, this was his first regional win ever. Ground Zero now sit at 4th in the OCE rankings, which is very impressive for a team that had no points heading into the event. For the next event, they secured themselves the 3 seed, which should put them in an easier group. However, if everyone wins their group as expected, this would put them on the same side of the bracket as Power, and they would have to face them in the semifinals. They also have a pretty tough road to Worlds, as there's an entire split's worth of points they need to make up in order to get there. Last year, OCE only sent 2 teams to the World Championship, and unless results get dramatically better in the next 2 events, I wouldn't expect any different this year. So it'll be interesting to see how far this Ground Zero roster can take it. Are they able to make up those points? Are they able to continue their form? They only dropped 1 game all tournament. Can they continue that next tournament? I guess we'll just have to wait and see in 2 weeks.